Edith Mary Kingdon Gould, born August 1864, dying November 1921, was an American actress and Gilded Age matron. She married George Jay Gould in 1885 at the age of 21, when he was also 21. George Jay Gould was the eldest son of railroad robber baron Jay Gould. Upon his father's death in 1892, George inherited a portion of the Gould fortune. He would receive 15 million, and 10 million was distributed to George's 5 siblings. He received his father's railroad holdings, including the DRGW and the Missouri Pacific Railroad. While in charge of his father's holdings at the turn of the 20th century, he sent surveyors and engineers through California's Feather River Canyon to stake out a route for the railroad to reach San Francisco, California. This was the Gilded Age, when American businessmen could make money by devoting themselves to American infrastructure projects. Edith Kingdon married George Jay before he was sure of his own inheritance, which probably endeared her to him. Kingdon was born in 1864 in Brooklyn, New York, and educated in England. She was the daughter of Charles Dennis Kingdon and Mary Carter of Toronto, Ontario. Edith turned to acting as a way of supporting her mother, who had been left penniless when Edith's father died young. She had to abandon her schooling and manners in England and appeared on the stage in Brooklyn in 1882 before being noticed and taken on the road in several leading roles with a company from Boston. In 1884, she came to the attention of Augustine Daly, one of the most influential men in American theater, and her career skyrocketed, principally in Boston, but also touring in Europe. That November, while performing in New York as Mrs. Marjorie Gwynne in Love in Crutches, she made a young Mr. Gould weak at the knees. Aside from her talent treading the boards, she was also viewed as one of the great beauties of her day. She was a true showgirl, appearing on Edwardian cabaret cards and cigarette ads. In July 1886, news reached New York from Paris that she was engaged to railroad heir George Jay Gould. Many hopeful would-be fathers-in-law and debutantes refused to believe it, but in September they were married in the drawing room at Lyndhurst. This is not the Lyndhurst of Pittsburgh, which you can learn about on this channel, but the Lyndhurst located in Tarrytown, Westchester, New York. It was a quiet ceremony with all the Gould family in attendance, but being an only child and without her father, Edith's mother was the only member of her family there. It was reported that the gossips who have conjured up bogeys in the matrimonial path of George Gould would have been deeply pained to see the pleasure there so universal and so manifest. She was said to have won the affections of the Goulds when George presented her to his family over a year before. The reformed ways, the clever sallies, the lovable disposition of the young woman won admiration and regard. The Goulds initially lived at 1 East 57th Street, which was connected by a passage to her in-laws' mansion on Fifth Avenue. 1 East 57th Street now houses the Louis Vuitton store. In 1882, the Goulds built a typically Victorian, it's also been called Beaux-Arts, 50-room mansion 10 blocks further north on Fifth Avenue. But after just 15 years, they scratched it entirely in favor of a spacious modern Beaux-Arts home, 857 Fifth Avenue, that they put up in its place. These were good times for Edith. In 1903, George lavished her with pearls valued at $500,000 from Tiffany's, which she is repeatedly photographed with. And in 1908, he presented her with their new mansion, Georgian Court, as a place from which she could entertain equal to any society hostess, regardless of their background. Over the years, Edith's once admired buxom figure relaxed with age and childbirth, and as she began to spend more time at their country home, Georgian Court, her husband's eye began to rove. In a bid to win back his attentions, aside from taking up golf, which he loved, she began to wear a prescribed tight rubber suit under her clothes to constrict unwanted bulges. Having quit the stage to marry George, she didn't altogether abandon her natural calling, and on at least 2 occasions starred in private performances. In Twilight of the Gods in 1899, a play put on in the carriage house at Georgian Court, written and directed by none other than Edith Wharton. You can learn more about Wharton's life and loves on this channel. During World War I, Edith was chairman of the Entertainment Committee of the New York City Mayor's Committee of Women on National Defense. In that capacity, she directed entertainments given at the Brooklyn Navy Yard and at various hospitals across the city. This is similar to other Gilded Age mansions, including in the Berwind family, which you can learn about on this channel. Her city mansion became the committee's de facto warehouse, storing theatrical properties, wigs, grease paints, costumes, etc. In 1908, after 23 years of marriage, she returned to acting, appearing in a 1-act play opposite Frederick Townsend Martin. Perhaps this break was due to her discovery of her husband's affair with a showgirl, which would result in the first affair baby in 1915. The play Mrs. Van Vechten's Divorce Dance, an interesting title, was performed in the ballroom of the Plaza Hotel. Her performance was attended by Commodore Elbridge Thomas Gary and his wife, Mrs. Vanderbilt, Gladys Vanderbilt, Eileen French Vanderbilt, Mrs. Emily Vanderbilt Sloane, Marian Anthon Fish, wife of Stuyvesant Fish, Ruth Livingston Mills, wife of Ogden Mills, Anne Harriman Vanderbilt, and many others prominent in New York society, perhaps as a show of strength to Gould. Edith and George hired Bruce Price to build their new home, which they called Georgian Court. This site is now Georgian Court University. Together, George and Edith had the following children: Kingdon Gould Sr., who was born in 1887 and died in 1945, Jay Gould II, born in 1888, dying in 1935. He was a tennis player who married Anne Douglas Graham, a descendant of Hawaiian royalty. Marjorie Gwynne Gould, presumably named after Edith's stage presence, born in 1891, dying in 1955, who married Anthony Joseph Drexel III, the son of Anthony Joseph Drexel Jr., Helen Vivian Gould, born in 1893, dying in 1931, who married John Beresford, 5th Baron Decies. George Jay Gould II, born in 1896, dying in 1963, who married and later divorced Laura Carter. Edith Catherine Gould, born in 1901, dying in 1937, who married Carol Livingston Wainwright. And Gloria Gould, presumably named after one of George's sisters, born in 1906, dying in 1943, who married Henry A. Bishop II, and after a divorce married Walter McFarlane Barker. You can see that these children were produced in pretty rapid succession. In November, on November 13th or 14th, accounts differ, playing off the 5th tee with George, by then the father of 2 children, by his younger mistress in 1921, on their 9-hole golf course at Georgian Court, Edith dropped dead of a heart attack. The job of the 2 physicians called to the estate in Lakewood Township, New Jersey, to determine the cause of death was made that much easier when the excruciating rubber undergarment was revealed and removed. After a private funeral at the Gould home, Edith was buried in Woodlawn Cemetery, Bronx, in the Jay Gould Mausoleum. Despite the fact that she knew her husband kept a mistress housed with the 2 children born from their affair, she was not bitter about it, which was reflected in her will. "To my beloved husband," she said, she gave their mansion on 5th Avenue and all therein, plus another property that was in her name, 177 East 64th Street in New York City. She was perhaps influenced by Gould shielding her from discrimination due to her showgirl past. These properties were then thought to be worth somewhere between $2 to $3 million at the time. However, not unreasonably, she did stipulate in her will that should her husband remarry, these properties would pass to their children. and not him. Just 6 months later, he and showgirl Guinevere Jeanne Sinclair did marry. Guinevere Jeanne Sinclair was born in 1885, the year of her first husband's marriage to Edith, and she died in 1978. She had the following children with George Gould: George Sinclair Gould, born in 1915, dying in 2003, who later changed his name to Broderick, his stepfather's name; Jane Sinclair Gould, born in 1916, dying in 1948, and Guinevere Gould, born in 1922, dying in 1968. They moved to England, perhaps to avoid society chatter. Gould died of pneumonia in May 1923 on the French Riviera after contracting a fever in Egypt, where he visited the tomb of Tutankhamun and was a potential recipient of one of its curses. When Gould died, approximately a third of his multi-million-dollar estate was devoted to paying his debts, showing his decision-making when it came to matrimony and finance wasn't the greatest. Let's take a look at Edith's fashion. Edith's clothing choices are sometimes more traditional than those of her sisters-in-law, Helen and Gloria Gould. Edith recognized the power of selecting the right couturier, super sensitive to society due to her own father-in-law's ousting from it. Edith patronized the House of Worth, the mainstay of American socialites, and you can learn about that fashion house on this channel. Edith may have patronized Worth as much for social cachet as for his ability to design for the superior wasp-waist figures of American women. She made bold choices in clothing, utilizing red fern, who was the choice of aristocrats in France and England. Although red fern succeeded Worth in Europe, he was not particularly successful with clients in the United States, who continued to patronize Worth throughout the 1930s. Edith Gould followed the American custom and went to Worth to purchase the type of dress that displayed her hourglass figure, and this dress from 1898 is still in existence today. It is a red velvet evening gown with an S-curve silhouette. Gould was known for her voluptuousness, and Worth's choice of dramatic red fabric color, simple embellishment, and exquisite draping illustrate that he knew how to use Edith Gould's assets to best advantage. She would also be painted in this gown with fur. The red fern fancy dress, with a square neckline and elaborate gold trim, resembles a costume for an Elizabethan theatrical, which Edith would have been familiar with from her time on the stage, and it would have been worn during a period in which costume balls were extremely popular. Red fern does not frequently appear in American couture collections or exhibitions, as he was not particularly successful with clients, and he was located in France and England, not the United States. But Gould patronized red fern extensively, and may have influenced Helen and Edith, who both own gowns by him. There is also an Edith Kingdon, who appeared in several films after Edith's death, such as When Nights Were Bold of 1929 and Fugitive Road of 1934. Photos of her are mixed with Edith's, and so this is a different woman who potentially used Edith's name as a stage name to capitalize on her popularity and social recognition.